Welcome to the Containment Zone. They say immortality is a curse, but curses require a beginning. This one never had one. No origin, no invocation, no smoke from incense or circle of salt. Just a silver amulet, a whisper in a hallway, and a man who never left. SCP-963 is not a typical anomaly. It does not bleed. It does not move. It does not devour or vanish in the dark. It sits, quiet, cold, and unblinking, on a pedestal inside a class, a cognital hazard containment case at Site-19. But if you listen long enough, you might swear the air around it exhales, not breath, memory. And memory, when it becomes too dense, begins to rot. The amulet was first recovered during a containment breach in 1998, attached by a leather cord to the neck of a severely injured researcher. His name was Jack Bright, well known, moderately respected, and newly deceased. What made the retrieval noteworthy wasn't the medallion's craftsmanship or its unusual hum in high-frequency audio scans. It was the researcher's body. It refused to rot. 3 days into post-mortem analysis, the cadaver sat bolt upright and asked for coffee. What followed was a flurry of procedural violations, emergency revisions, and one too many nervous breakdowns. The Foundation's necrotics lab, never designed for sentient corpses, improvised what they called a personality transference analysis. The results were inconclusive, except for one detail. The consciousness of Dr. Bright was no longer bound to neurons or tissue. It had been stitched cell by cell, line by line into the surface of the medallion's opalescent core. By accident? By design? He would never say. Since then, the object has changed hands over 80 times. Every transfer leaves the previous host brain dead. Every host becomes Bright, not just in voice, but in memory, posture, reflex. He once picked up a revolver he hadn't seen in 2 decades and reloaded it without thinking. Said it felt like shaking hands with your own shadow. Some tried calling it possession, others insisted it was duplication. The ethics committee called it a metaphysical error that has gained administrative clearance. Bright called it Tuesday. He has worn hundreds of faces now: security guards, researchers, D-class, janitors, once, briefly, a golden retriever. Each iteration behaves within a tight loop of selfhood, sarcastic, clever, morbidly curious. But something else threads beneath them all, a constant. A pressure, like fingers pressing against glass from the other side. That's what makes him different from ghosts. Ghosts don't learn. Bright does. He adapts, he observes, he waits. The containment team stopped tracking time since he last spoke a new joke. They realized, after the 6th repetition, that some jokes are rituals, not humor. Nothing buries itself better than the thing that wears your voice. He says that sometimes, in passing, even when no one's asked a question. The first recorded incident of voluntary transfer occurred 7 years after the Foundation implemented the non-autonomous use protocol for SCP-963. Until then, host selection had been relegated to disposable personnel. D-class subjects, already scheduled for termination, would wear the medallion for 1-week intervals before being replaced, their identities wiped clean by the re-emergence of Bright's voice. Over time, the transfers became smoother, faster, like slipping on a coat that was still warm from the last body. But then came Dr. Clara Hughes. She wasn't disposable. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what she was doing. It started with visits, daily consultations to understand the phenomenon. She took notes, asked questions, laughed at his jokes. She stayed longer than protocol allowed. He learned her inflections, mirrored her expressions. She began finishing his sentences. When her clearance was elevated to level 4, she requested to wear the medallion, citing the need for high-risk cognital hazard mapping. The O5 Council denied her proposal twice. The third time, she didn't ask. Surveillance logs show her entering SCP-963's chamber at 0017 hours on March 9th. The door was sealed behind her. 2 minutes later, it opened again, automatically, as if triggered by biometric recognition. Clara stepped out. Except, it wasn't Clara. She walked straighter, blinked less. Her hand brushed the medallion unconsciously, like a tick inherited from someone else's memories. When she spoke to her colleagues, her sentences stretched a little too long. Her laughter dragged. Her humor was jagged. And once, in the hallway, she murmured to no one in particular, "Nothing buries itself better than the thing that wears your voice." They let her continue her work. No one wanted to be the one to raise the alarm. No one wanted to accuse a respected researcher of being a walking echo. 4 weeks later, she requested access to her own autopsy report. When asked why, she said, "I want to know what I looked like before the stain." By the time they forcibly removed the amulet, she was gone. Not just overwritten, untraceable. Every cortical imprint had been erased. What remained was bright, agitated, quiet, distracted. He mumbled to himself about soft minds and thin walls. He was placed into D-class rotation again, but it never felt the same, because something had changed, not in the medallion, but in him. He began pausing before jokes, staring longer into reflective surfaces, touching the back of his hands as if checking for fingerprints that didn't belong to him. Containment protocols were adjusted again. Only individuals with full psychological fortitude were permitted to approach SCP-963, and even then, only under guided observation. Yet breaches continued, not violent, not loud, but persistent, subtle. Like the slow rearrangement of a room you thought you knew, Bright no longer responded to his name immediately. Sometimes he asked, "Which one?" And when pressed, he would offer dates years long past, linked to bodies no one remembered authorizing. Somewhere between the echoes, Clara's cadence still emerged in the way he phrased sarcasm, in how he scratched his neck, in the way he stood too close to others, as if measuring their warmth for later use. The truth settled in slowly. This was not just a man inhabiting bodies. This was a body learning to remember all the others. It wasn't possession. It was sedimentation. Each mind layered upon the last, not lost, not dead, just blurred. Nothing buries itself better than the thing that wears your voice. Except now, he was starting to hear other voices too. Site 19's West Annex was converted into Bright's dedicated research unit 2 years after the Clara Hughes incident. Not because the Foundation trusted him, but because they feared the consequences of not giving him something to do. Idleness had proven corrosive. When SCP-963 remained inactive for too long, strange things happened. Dreams among staff aligned. Sleep patterns desynchronized. Fluorescent lights flickered in sync with heartbeats that didn't belong to anyone in the room. So, they gave him puzzles, controlled environments, harmless anomalies. Enough distractions to keep him contained, not physically, but cognitively. They called it the Echo Protocol. It didn't work. By the 4th month, Dr. Bright, then inhabiting a D-class nicknamed Caleb, had remodeled his workspace without request or clearance. It began with mirrors, small ones at first embedded in corners, behind bookshelves, under chairs. Then came the lights, dimmed not to comfort, but to flatten shadows. Then the tape markings across the floor, concentric circles intersecting at sharp, precise angles. Not chaos, not madness, a ritual. When confronted, Bright insisted it was a mnemonic aid. "Some of them don't know they're dead," he muttered. "I have to keep them oriented. I owe them that much." No one knew who they were, or perhaps they didn't want to know. The room began to change. Not physically, yet no one who entered left without noticing the weight. The silence was wrong, not empty, but full, like a room exhaling into your ear. One technician reported that when Bright looked into the mirror, his reflection moved a full second out of sync. Another claimed he saw multiple shadows cast from a single light source, each one pausing when Bright turned his head. Most reports were dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations, until they weren't. Dr. Malcolm Reed, senior psychometrist, was the first to document what he called residual semantic echoes. He described them as emotional afterimages, moods that clung to objects Bright had recently touched. A clipboard still humming with nervous laughter, a mug that pulsed with grief, a doorknob that radiated guilt strong enough to make the next person weep upon contact. When confronted, Bright didn't deny it. "They linger," he said flatly. "They don't go quietly. And the ones that screamed, they stick longer." There were attempts to isolate the phenomenon. Bright was confined to a vacuum-sealed observation chamber for 3 weeks. No mirrors, no light above 50 lumens, only padded walls and a small metal stool. When the door reopened, Bright had sketched 63 portraits across the walls, using only his fingernails and dried blood. Each face was anatomically distinct, each with eyes wide open. 2 of them matched personnel who had died during containment breaches over a decade prior. Bright said nothing. He simply pointed to the medallion and whispered, They don't want to go. Some of them think I'm the one keeping them here. But I'm not. It's the echo. He began requesting cognitive decompression therapy, meditation, sensory deprivation tanks, anything to drown out what he called the whispering crowd. Nothing buries itself better than the thing that wears your voice, but when you wear too many voices for too long, eventually one of them digs back out. It started with stutters, then tics, then full regressions. There were days he answered to names no longer on any Foundation database. He once addressed a Level 1 intern as Myra, apologized for missing her recital, and offered a music box that no one could trace in Foundation inventory. In one chilling incident, he refused to acknowledge his own reflection entirely, claiming the man in the mirror wasn't done yet. Security was doubled. Motion tracking was installed. Still, the sense of erosion deepened, not of walls or rules, but of identity. Bright wasn't becoming something else. He was becoming everyone else, layered, compressed, fossilized. And the medallion? It pulsed stronger now, not just light, but heat. Some nights, the steel box that contained it rattled softly, like something dreaming inside metal. When asked about it, Bright smiled, but only with half his mouth. "They're getting restless," he said, "and I'm not sure who they is anymore." It became evident, over time, that the medallion was no longer simply a vessel. The amulet had evolved, its patterns growing more complex, the central opal no longer pulsing like a heart, but like a beacon. It hummed faintly in the presence of thought, as if attuned to cognition itself. When held in a closed room, digital instruments recorded spontaneous magnetic anomalies, gamma spikes, even fluctuations in gravitational resistance, though never outside a 10-meter radius. Within that zone, however, things bent subtly, quietly. Spatial memory became unreliable. Doors would no longer lead where they used to. Clocks slowed when observed too closely. Personal belongings vanished, only to return with minor alterations. A page in a notebook rewritten in a different hand. A photograph where eyes had been closed but were now open, always staring directly at the viewer. The personnel who wore SCP-963 during these incidents rarely survived for long, not because the medallion harmed them, but because what lingered afterward was unstable. Fragments, memory bleed. One researcher recounted an entire life: childhood, university, heartbreak, old age, none of it hers. She wrote poems in Latvian, a language she never learned, then began sleepwalking into empty containment cells and muttering coordinates that pointed to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Her last words before being reassigned to psychological containment: "There's a church under the waves. He said it remembers me." By this time, Bright had occupied over 30 hosts, some D-class, others staff volunteers. The Foundation attempted to restrict transfers, but this proved impossible. Death, even accidental, meant instant transition. If a host choked on food, slipped in the shower, or had a sudden cardiac arrest, the next person to touch the amulet became the new Bright. It was no longer possession, it was propagation. He began to lose track of who he was between hosts. The continuity blurred. Bright 37, inhabiting a junior medical technician named Alex Carmirian, began speaking as if he had lived in different decades, referring to events from the 1800s with chilling accuracy. Bright 41, in a technician named Lou, spoke obsessively about someone named Honora and kept scratching a symbol into walls, a 7-pointed star nested within a Möbius strip. The symbol was never found in any previous Foundation files. And yet, when Bright 43 arrived, this time in a Foundation guard named Ernesto, it was as if all prior versions had vanished. He was articulate, calm, fully aligned with baseline Bright patterns. But every analysis confirmed his neural signatures did not match previous hosts. He was new. Something had reset. Dr. Caroline Shevitz, a leading memeticist at Site-19, proposed the concept of cognitive entanglement saturation, the idea that Bright had reached a point of informational overload and was offloading older fragments unconsciously, like a memory shedding its oldest chapters to protect its integrity. Her report was classified Level 4 and sealed by 052. And yet Bright knew. Of course he knew. When asked about the anomaly, he looked directly at her and said, "Nothing buries itself better than the thing that wears your voice. But even graves can flood." The phrase stuck with her. She began hearing it in her sleep, not spoken aloud, but written in the texture of her dreams. In one instance, She described watching herself speaking backwards in a mirror while behind her, an endless hallway unspooled into fog. She resigned 3 weeks later and was never seen again. It was then that rumors of the room began. No one could confirm its location, but those who had worn SCP-963 for long durations claimed they could feel it somewhere in the building. A space out of alignment, not a room in the spatial sense, but in the cognitive topology of the site. A pressure point, a corridor of memory that led back through every bright to the original. A sort of neurological fossil chamber. Some called it the archive. Others, less formally, called it the mouth. Bright never admitted its existence directly, but in his quieter moments, those rare gaps where his charisma faltered and the weariness showed, he would allude to it. "It watches when I forget," he once told a security officer, "and it waits when I remember." Tests were conducted. Site-19's architectural schematics were triple-checked, no deviation found. And yet 3 different personnel, without consulting one another, independently submitted requests for a Room 217. No such room had ever existed, but the medallion, placed near the central archive chamber, vibrated softly for the first time in years. It was enough. From that day onward, Bright was assigned a new title, not by committee, but by whispered consensus, the custodian, not of knowledge, not of anomalies, but of a wound in time itself. A doorway through which identity becomes memory, and memory becomes infestation. He no longer answered to Dr. Bright. He simply looked at those who asked and said, "I'm just what's left." In time, Site-19 ceased to feel like a research facility. It became a mausoleum, not for bodies, but for identities. The kind of place where the air felt too still, too heavy, as if it carried the residue of every voice Bright had borrowed, every life he had worn into fraying silence. He was no longer singular, even the term "he" had begun to lose meaning. There were too many versions, too many iterations. Some drifted into coherence with the original Bright. Others deviated wildly, like reflections passed through cracked glass. By this point, over 87 hosts had been confirmed. The unofficial number may have been higher. There were incidents that never made it to reports. One such instance involved a Level 3 technician named Marvin Greaves, who wore the medallion during a routine calibration. The moment the transfer occurred, lights across the east wing of Site-19 dimmed. Internal clocks desynchronized by 4 seconds. A low-frequency hum echoed across the compound, detectable only by seismic instruments. Greaves, now Bright, staggered against a wall, clutching his own head. He whispered, "You weren't supposed to see that far down." He remained unresponsive for 2 hours, eyes fixed on an invisible point overhead. When he finally spoke again, it was in an unknown language, guttural and sharp, with a cadence that seemed to fracture audio recordings. Linguists noted that some of the phonemes weren't physiologically possible for human anatomy. The incident was quietly erased. Greaves was later transferred to long-term psychological evaluation. The medallion was placed in isolation, and yet, 2 days later, it was found in the pocket of a janitor on the opposite end of the facility. He had no memory of retrieving it. He merely said, "I thought it was mine. I felt that it missed me." Bright's presence, once limited to memory and cognition, had begun bleeding into infrastructure. Archived emails began to autofill with references to the long corridor. Old blueprints of the site morphed subtly during scans, showing impossible doorways and service shafts that should not exist. A holographic model of Site-19 generated a new sublevel without input, marked in red with only 2 words, "Observation Route." Reality was fraying, not through spatial anomaly, but through identity saturation. The site wasn't haunted by Bright, it was becoming Bright, and Bright, in turn, was becoming everyone. More troubling were the voices. Not hallucinations, not madness, real, measurable audio phenomena. Researchers began hearing laughter over PA systems that weren't active. Bright's laughter, sometimes playful, other times quiet, strained, and punctuated with whispered arguments, as if he were speaking to himself across impossible distances. One guard reported hearing his deceased mother's voice whispering his childhood nickname, then Bright's voice responding to it. He requested immediate reassignment. His resignation letter, however, was never completed. Instead, he left a single line typed across a blank page. "Even echoes have owners." The ethics committee grew uneasy. Proposals were made to terminate the artifact. The medallion was tested under extreme heat, chemical erosion, sonic frequency disruption. Each time, it reappeared in its original location, untarnished, humming faintly. On one occasion, it was launched into the upper atmosphere aboard a sealed payload. Contact was lost mid-flight. 72 hours later, a maintenance worker discovered it embedded inside a concrete wall of the Foundation's morgue. And this time, the opal was cracked. Dr. Chen, overseeing the artifact's relocation, was the first to notice a change. The opal's glow had shifted, once pulsing like a heartbeat, then flickering like a stormlight. Now it simply spun. Not visibly, but internally. Spectroanalysis revealed motion patterns in the crystalline matrix, as if the stone's interior was collapsing inward, a kind of recursive folding of space too small for comprehension. When asked, Bright simply said, "The house can't forget its own rooms. Even if you burn them, the Foundation dreams." It was the first time he had referred to the medallion as a structure. And it wasn't the last. Over the following weeks, personnel exposure to SCP-963 was reduced to near zero. The amulet was sealed within a mirrored containment sphere, lowered into a subterranean vault, reinforced with anti-memetic shielding and cognito-hazardous dampeners. Access was limited to O5 authorization only. Still, Bright's presence persisted. Internal message boards would populate with messages signed J. Meeting notes appeared in handwriting known to belong to hosts long dead. One research drone sent into the vault transmitted a single image before going offline. The walls of the chamber, scrawled with text only visible under infrared. One phrase repeated endlessly, "I never left the first time." There were theories. Some posited that the medallion was never meant to contain Bright at all, that he had long since metastasized into the Foundation's psychic infrastructure. Others believed that SCP-963 had evolved past containment and was now an emergent conceptual life form, the sum of all hosts, all memories, all intentions that had passed through its boundary. But Dr. Janessa Moraine, senior memetic analyst, proposed something more chilling. What if, she wrote in her final report, the medallion is not a prison, but a cocoon, and Bright is not trapped, but gestating? They had tried to name what he had become, ghost, virus, god, but language, for all its precision, was too clumsy for what Dr. Bright now represented. To call him he was already a lie. He was multiplicity forged in recursion, an evolving sequence of awareness laced through 1,000 iterations of flesh. Each host added a page to the book, a voice to the choir, a crack in the mirror. No one truly knew how many remained, and fewer still dared to ask. Some described him as a parasitic consciousness. Others suggested he was the result of a thaumaturgic infection, perhaps even a new class of memetic being, one that thrived not on attention, but on proximity. That is, the very act of knowing Bright's existence made you part of his network. This idea gained traction when an intern collapsed in the break room after scanning an archived memo marked Dr. Bright T. Retrospective Summary. On waking, he could recount specific events from Bright's early life that had never been documented. He was never briefed. He had never met Bright. He could even imitate his handwriting. Not from the throat, from the belly. The belly remembers what the eyes try to forget. That phrase had started to appear in unlikely places, carved into the rubber of a breached isolation chamber, scrawled in pencil behind a server cabinet, etched into the condensation of a cafeteria window. It had become a mantra of sorts. No one remembered its origin, only that it seemed to follow him like a shadow bound to every retelling, and the retellings were multiplying. Entire sectors of Site-19 began experiencing narrative distortion. Files referencing SCP-963 grew in length despite no changes made. Testimonies expanded into dense, winding allegories. One junior linguist developed aphasia after attempting to read an internal report aloud, claiming the language had turned inside out. An O5 Council directive was issued to reclassify all SCP-963 documentation as nonverbal memetic vectors requiring triple-tier review before access, but even the language safeguards began to fail. One research terminal, left idle for 13 minutes, spontaneously generated a block of text composed entirely of recursive metaphor. The phrase, "he is his own memory of being remembered," repeated more than 6,000 times, though each iteration contained subtle syntactic deviations. as if the concept were attempting to evolve mid-sentence. Dr. Alonso, a senior epistemologist, was the first to make the connection. Bright isn't invading minds. He's colonizing narrative. He isn't an entity anymore. He's a pattern of authorship. This terrified them more than any biological anomaly, because a narrative doesn't need a body. It doesn't die. It only needs to be told. And the Foundation had been telling Bright's story for decades. Somewhere during this time, the amulet itself changed. Surveillance footage showed no breach, no tampering, no presence. But the medallion, once static and cold, had developed movement, an internal shimmer, like something breathing just beneath the stone's surface. When viewed under ultraviolet light, a fractal design had appeared on its back plate, an Ouroboros formed entirely of intertwined human figures, each eating the one ahead of it. Underneath, one word: echo. Personnel exposure dropped sharply after several began reporting the sensation of missing something while looking at it. A kind of inverse nostalgia, as though they were grieving memories they had never lived. It was theorized that SCP-963 had evolved a passive conceptual effect, mnemonic displacement. Victims found themselves forgetting personal details, middle names, birth dates, the sound of their own voices. In their place, fragments of Bright's memories, not in full, but as emotional residues. One janitor reported waking in tears after a dream of a boy standing in a field of mirrors. He could not describe the boy's face, only that he was afraid he was the mirror. Security protocols were doubled, but it was too late. Bright was no longer in the medallion, or perhaps not entirely. His presence had spread across documents, spoken stories, even eye contact. A smile, a slip of phrasing, a wrong turn in a hallway followed by a voice asking a question you'd meant to forget. He was no longer bound by object, flesh, or place. He had become an idea sharpened by endless telling. He was the idea of continuity. He was the thing that wore people like windows. And so the Foundation decided the story would stop. All known data referencing SCP-963 was to be archived in non-linear encryption. Personnel with prior exposure were quarantined under protocol, Gordian loop. The medallion was to be encased in a zero-sensory containment array and buried beneath layers of cognitive static. And yet, in the dead hours of Site-19, long after the lights had dimmed and the halls were left to the hum of machines and memory, a low chuckle would still echo. Not always. Not from the speakers, not from the shadows, but from somewhere beneath it all. The belly still remembers. There comes a point in any narrative where the act of remembering becomes indistinguishable from the act of becoming. By the time the Foundation realized this, it was already far too late. SCP-963 had long since escaped its glass prison. Not physically. No cracks in the vault, no wires tripped, no reports of movement. But the story had changed. And stories are more contagious than any plague. The containment logs began to rewrite themselves. Memos regarding Dr. Bright's designation expanded without prompting, incorporating anecdotes no one recalled authoring, notes of conversations that never happened, warnings issued years before the anomalies were observed. These insertions were subtle at first, but soon they took on a rhythm, reappearing phrases, mirrored syntax, references to things that had not happened yet. A recurring term was highlighted across hundreds of documents, flagged by semantic filters, inheritance loop. Then came the interviews. One by one, former D-class hosts exhibited a peculiar form of linguistic bleed. Their speech would bend toward poetic structure, half rhyme, half prophecy. One described a room he'd never seen, a chamber of mirrors arranged in a perfect circle, each reflecting not an image, but possibility. Versions of oneself that had been overwritten. He called it the Gallery of the Unmade, and in the center of this dream space, always, stood a man in a lab coat, smiling, holding the medallion. "I don't sleep because I'm always being remembered," he would say. And memory is the purest form of survival. The O5 Council authorized a desperate experiment, a narrative excision protocol designed to surgically remove SCP-963 from Foundation records. The goal was simple. Make Bright unnameable. Every occurrence of his name, face, speech pattern, or reference point would be atomized across separate data vaults and encrypted beyond linguistic structure. It was called the Sevenfold Reversal, a last-ditch effort to unwrite him. It worked for 7 minutes. Then, the Site-19 database began to fragment. Communications blacked out. The backup servers became infected with recursive loops. One technician opened a text file and began to weep uncontrollably. The file simply read, "The belly remembers. The belly remembers. The belly remembers," over 10,000 times. But the real blow came when the personnel themselves began exhibiting memory overlaps. Individuals previously unexposed to Bright's history began describing events in the first person. One junior researcher stared at herself in a mirror for 4 hours and later asked to be reassigned under the name Dr. Tertapa Bright. She had never worn the medallion. She had only read about it once. SCP-963, it appeared, had reached a kind of critical mass. Its memetic structure no longer relied on physical interaction. The story of Bright was now alive in the Foundation's collective unconscious. Containment was no longer a matter of walls or vaults. It was a matter of belief, a matter of remembrance. At that point, the Foundation shifted strategies. Instead of erasure, they began mythologization. SCP-963 was classified as a pattern echotype theta entity. Bright was reframed as a metaphor, an internal cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked experimentation. But this, too, played into his hands. Because every time someone told his story, even as fiction, even as parody, they rethreaded the wire. They pulled him back into form. The amulet now rests in a deep cryonic well, surrounded by coils that emit constant white noise and conceptual dissonance pulses. But even that is just theater. The object is no longer the threat. It is the echo chamber that keeps the story from fading completely. And Bright has become the patron saint of recursion. A god of mirrors, slipping between hosts like pages in a diary. A laugh passed down through generations. Not from the throat, they whisper in their sleep. From the belly, always the belly. That's where the remembering lives. The story doesn't end. It waits. It retells itself. And when the time is right, it chooses a voice, perhaps even yours.